You may think of ancient Rome as a place of grand architecture, iconic figures, and astonishing achievements, but beneath its marble exterior lies a darker, more chaotic side, one that even history struggles to come to terms with. The Roman Empire, at its peak, was a society of contradictions. A civilization that gave us roads, aqueducts, and representative government, but also one that saw ruthless emperors who were willing to destroy their own cities for no other reason than their whims. One emperor, in particular, took this notion of chaos to unimaginable extremes. His name was Nero, and his reign was marked not by grandeur, but by madness. In the year 64 AD, one of the most infamous events in the history of the Roman Empire occurred: the Great Fire of Rome. While many have been led to believe it was an unfortunate accident, a closer look at Nero's actions suggests something far darker and more intentional. Nero was no mere spectator in this disaster. He was, in many ways, the architect of the inferno that consumed his own city. But why? What drove him to burn his own capital to the ground? And how did this event shape the legacy of one of history's most controversial emperors? Today, we'll take you on a journey through the twisted world of Nero's Rome. We'll explore how his reign plunged the empire into a period of instability, decadence, and terror. We'll see how this emperor, once hailed as a beacon of hope, became a living nightmare for those who lived under his rule. And, most chillingly, we'll understand the psychology behind Nero's decision to set fire to Rome, the city he was supposed to protect. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment to think about the history, Do you think you truly know it all? Do you feel like you understand the true depths of the Roman Empire's darkness? If so, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what you think of the Roman emperors, specifically Nero, and if you believe his reign deserves the reputation it carries today. Your thoughts matter. Let's dive into Nero's twisted story. Nero was born in 37 AD into a world that would soon see the rise of one of its most notorious emperors. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a woman of immense ambition and ruthless nature. She engineered Nero's ascent to power, ensuring that her son would become emperor at a young age. At just 16, Nero became the ruler of Rome, but it didn't take long for his reign to take a turn for the worse. Initially, many were hopeful about his rule. Nero's early years were filled with promises of reform and a break from the corruption of previous emperors. However, this brief period of hope was shattered as Nero's true nature began to emerge. His cruelty, paranoia, and erratic behavior soon became apparent to all who had hoped for a different kind of emperor. By 64 AD, Rome had become a city full of tension. The empire was still recovering from years of war, and the people of Rome were restless. Public discontent was growing, and Nero's extravagance was a constant point of criticism. However, the emperor had a solution. He would entertain the people by giving them grand spectacles and lavish events. His passion for the arts, particularly music and acting, was no secret, and he was known to take the stage himself, much to the dismay of his critics. But it was Nero's obsession with grandeur and power that would eventually lead to a catastrophic event: the Great Fire of Rome. The fire began on the night of July 18, 64 AD. It started in the shops around the Circus Maximus, a large open-air stadium used for chariot races. The fire spread rapidly, and soon it engulfed much of the city, reducing buildings to rubble and leaving thousands of people homeless. While the fire raged, Nero was said to have been in Antium, a seaside villa away from the city. When he finally returned, the damage was already done. Many Romans believed that Nero had been responsible for the fire, or at the very least had allowed it to spread unchecked. The idea that Nero might have intentionally set the fire was not out of the question, given his reputation for cruelty and his constant desire for more power. In fact, historical sources suggest that Nero may have actually started the fire himself, using it as a means to clear space for his grand new construction project: his personal palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The thought of an emperor setting fire to his own city for personal gain is shocking, but it wasn't entirely without precedent in Roman history. Nero's predecessors had often used grand architectural projects as a way to legitimize their rule and cement their legacy. But Nero took this to a new extreme. He wasn't just rebuilding. He was reshaping the entire city to suit his tastes. The Domus Aurea was to be a sprawling complex of gardens, courtyards, and massive halls. A palace unlike anything the world had ever seen. The fire that consumed Rome provided Nero with the perfect opportunity to realize his vision. He would later use the destruction of the city as an excuse to build his magnificent palace. This, however, did not go unnoticed by the public, and many Romans were outraged by Nero's lack of empathy and his willingness to sacrifice their homes for his own vanity. But Nero did not stop there. As the fire burned, the emperor turned his focus to the aftermath. Rather than taking responsibility for the destruction or providing relief to those affected, he shifted the blame onto another group, Christians. Nero's persecution of Christians began shortly after the fire, marking the start of one of the most brutal periods in Roman history for the early Christian community. Nero accused the Christians of starting the fire, despite having no evidence to support this claim. This accusation gave him the pretext to unleash a wave of violence against the Christian population. Many were arrested, tortured, and executed in brutal ways. Some were thrown to wild animals in the arena, while others were burned alive, serving as human torches to light Nero's nighttime festivities. The persecution of Christians would continue for several years, and Nero's actions became a symbol of the empire's descent into madness. His cruelty knew no bounds, and he began to make increasingly erratic decisions, further alienating the people of Rome. While Nero's rule continued, it was clear that his empire was crumbling under the weight of his own madness. By 68 AD, revolts were breaking out across the empire, and Nero was facing opposition from within his own ranks. Desperate and increasingly paranoid, Nero tried to flee, but he was ultimately cornered by his enemies. In the end, he took his own life, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of a period of instability in the Roman Empire. Nero's death was not the end of his legacy, however. In the years that followed, his actions would be remembered as some of the most notorious in Roman history. He would be seen as the epitome of cruelty, decadence, and madness, a ruler who burned his own city for fun, only to be consumed by the very fire he had started. But while Nero's reign ended in disgrace, his story serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of a ruler who values their own vanity above the welfare of their people. His legacy, like the fire he started, is a symbol of destruction, both for the empire he once ruled and for the people who were forced to live under his tyranny. As we look back at Nero's reign, we are reminded of the fragility of power and the devastating impact of a leader who fails to act with responsibility and compassion. History, after all, has a way of judging those who wield power. It remembers not just the triumphs of a ruler, but also their failures and their cruelty. So, what can we learn from Nero's story? What does it tell us about the nature of power and the consequences of its abuse? It's simple. Even the most powerful empires can crumble when their rulers lose sight of the people they're meant to serve. Nero's reign may have been one of excess and decadence, but it also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of power without accountability. Nero's reign is not just a story of ancient Rome. It's a story of what happens when rulers lose their way. It's a reminder that even the greatest of empires can fall, and the worst of emperors can leave behind a legacy that endures far longer than their reign ever did. As we reflect on Nero's reign and his catastrophic actions, it's essential to understand how his decisions impacted not only the Roman Empire but also the generations that followed. Nero's reign wasn't merely a blip in history. It became a harbinger of the chaos and decadence that would later define the fall of empires throughout history. Nero's insanity, however, wasn't just limited to his obsession with building and burning. His actions reached far beyond the flames of Rome and the walls of his luxurious palace. His treatment of those around him, particularly his family, paints a chilling picture of the dangers of unchecked power and the corruption it breeds. Nero's relationship with his mother, Agrippina the Younger, provides another unsettling layer to his reign. Agrippina, whose ambition was the driving force behind her son's rise to power, became a casualty of his growing paranoia. In a desperate attempt to secure his rule, Nero had his mother murdered in a gruesome and cold-hearted way. First, he tried to have her poisoned, But when that failed, he ordered her to be killed by a group of assassins. His decision to kill his own mother demonstrated the depths of his cruelty, and it served as a stark reminder of the lengths he was willing to go to retain power. This event wasn't an isolated incident. Nero's reign was marked by a series of violent actions against those he saw as threats to his rule. He executed his stepbrother, Britannicus, out of fear that the young man might one day challenge his authority. He also ordered the deaths of several senators and political rivals, consolidating his power at the cost of countless lives. Nero's paranoia was only matched by his ruthlessness, and the people around him, whether family or political adversaries, were expendable in his pursuit of power. But what about the rest of the Roman population? How did they fare under Nero's rule? While the upper echelons of Roman society were often the target of his violent purges, it was the common people who felt the brunt of his selfishness and greed. Nero's extravagant spending on public spectacles, his lavish building projects, and his obsession with self-glorification drained the empire's resources. While he hosted grand gladiatorial games and extravagant banquets, the people of Rome struggled with rising taxes and food shortages. The Great Fire of Rome, which many believed Nero had orchestrated, only added to the public suffering. While the fire devastated vast portions of the city, leaving tens of thousands homeless, Nero took advantage of the situation to further his own ambitions. Instead of prioritizing the relief of the people, he used the opportunity to seize prime real estate for his own personal gain, constructing his magnificent golden house. This massive palace complex, with its vast gardens, grand halls, and extravagant decor, stood in stark contrast to the poverty and despair of the people living in the ruins of the fire. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero's choice to blame the Christians for the disaster only fueled the persecution of the early Christian community. By turning the Christians into scapegoats, Nero gave his regime an outlet for its cruelty, which would eventually spiral into one of the most infamous persecutions in history. Christians were rounded up, tortured, and executed in horrific ways, all in the name of Nero's desire to control the narrative and maintain his grip on power. But as the years passed, Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic. His once thriving empire began to unravel under the weight of his decisions. Revolts broke out in the provinces, and factions within the Roman Senate began to turn against him. Nero's unpopularity reached new heights as his reign descended into chaos. Even his closest advisors, once loyal to him, began to plot against him, realizing that his reign could only end in ruin. In 68 AD, the situation in Rome reached a breaking point. Facing rebellion from multiple fronts, Nero fled the city, knowing that his end was near. With no allies left and no way to escape his own destruction, Nero took his own life. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and Rome was thrown into a period of political instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors. This brief period saw multiple claimants to the throne, each vying for power in a fractured empire. Nero's death, however, did not bring an end to the legacy of his reign. Even after his passing, the impact of his decisions continued to reverberate throughout the empire. The public perception of Nero as a tyrant, a man who had destroyed his own city and persecuted countless people, endured for centuries. His story would be retold by historians, philosophers, and writers throughout the ages as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of empires. But what can we take from the legacy of Nero's reign? What lessons can we learn from the emperor who burned his own city for fun, who killed his own family members for power, and who destroyed the very empire he was meant to protect? The truth is, Nero's reign serves as a stark reminder that power, when held by those who lack compassion, can be devastating. Empires rise and fall, but the actions of their leaders leave a lasting mark on history. Nero's actions didn't just destroy lives during his time, they reverberated through the centuries, shaping the way we think about leadership, cruelty, and the abuse of power. So, as we look back at the Roman Empire and the legacy of Nero, let's remember the impact of his reign. While he may have been one of the most infamous emperors in history, his story is not just about the past. It's a warning for the present and the future. It reminds us that the choices made by those in power shape the world for generations to come. As we conclude this deep dive into the reign of Nero, it's important to reflect on the broader implications of his actions. Nero's reign wasn't just a tragic chapter in Roman history. It serves as a dark mirror, reflecting the dangers of absolute power when unchecked by morality or accountability. In his case, it wasn't just the personal tragedies that defined his legacy, but the catastrophic impact he had on an empire that had once seemed invincible. What makes Nero's actions even more haunting is the fact that his descent into madness wasn't a sudden event. It was a gradual transformation. Nero's early years as emperor were, in fact, promising. He was initially guided by trusted advisors, who helped him govern in a more just and balanced way. But as time went on, his desire for control, wealth, and status drove him to make more dangerous choices. His initial focus on the arts, while harmless in its infancy, became an obsession that overshadowed the real duties of a ruler. As his power grew, so did his disconnection from the people he was supposed to serve. The burning of Rome and the subsequent actions of Nero reveal a pattern of tyranny that didn't just hurt the empire in the short term, but destabilized it for generations. The fire itself was an act of destruction for personal gain, using human lives and history as mere pawns in his quest to build his legacy. But it was the persecution of the Christians, his brutal purges, and the extravagant spending on unnecessary projects that truly showcased the extent of his corruption. In many ways, Nero epitomized the dangers of a ruler who saw the empire not as a collective of people, but as a platform for their own ego. In the aftermath of Nero's death, the empire faced a power vacuum, a result of the instability he created. The Senate, once filled with fear under his reign, was left in disarray. The provinces, already discontented with his leadership, saw revolts and conflicts flare up, further plunging the empire into chaos. The year of the four emperors in 69 AD, which followed Nero's death, is a testament to the instability that his actions had caused. In less than a year, four different men claimed the throne, each trying to secure their own claim to power, and Rome found itself in the midst of an internal struggle that would forever change the course of its history. Nero's reign, while it lasted, served as a horrifying example of the dangers of absolute power. The man who once held the keys to one of the world's greatest empires was eventually brought down by his own reckless disregard for the lives and well-being of the people he ruled. His story was not one of glory, but of self-destruction. His end, dying alone and desperate, fleeing from the very people he had once ruled with an iron fist, was fitting. It demonstrated that no matter how powerful one may seem, if one abandons the principles of leadership and compassion, they are doomed to fall. But beyond the immediate consequences of Nero's reign, we must also consider the long-term effects of his actions. The collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty marked a pivotal moment in Roman history. While Rome would continue to thrive for centuries after, it never fully recovered from the internal fractures that Nero left in his wake. The subsequent emperors, like Vespasian and Trajan, would work tirelessly to restore Rome's prestige, but the scars left by Nero's reign were undeniable. Nero's destructive legacy also serves as a warning for the future, especially in modern politics. His ability to manipulate public opinion, shift blame, and prioritize personal gain over the welfare of the people he ruled mirrors some of the most dangerous tendencies we still see in leadership today. History often repeats itself, and if we are not vigilant, we might find ourselves under the sway of leaders who, like Nero, care only about their own legacy at the cost of the society they lead. As we look back at the life of Nero, we must ask ourselves, what makes a ruler great? Is it the ability to conquer lands or to build monuments? Or is it their ability to serve, protect, and uplift their people? Nero, for all his grandeur, was a ruler who only built for himself. His buildings, his monuments, his legacy, at the expense of everything else. And in the end, it was this selfishness that led to his demise. Nero's reign also offers an important lesson about the nature of power and its limits. Power, when wielded with cruelty and without consideration for others, can only go so far. Nero's inability to see beyond his own ego and his failure to understand the true responsibilities of leadership ultimately led to the downfall of his reign. And while the empire survived after his death, it would never be the same. The damage done by Nero was felt for years to come, and his name has remained synonymous with tyranny and madness. But perhaps the most profound lesson we can learn from Nero is the importance of accountability. A ruler, no matter how great their ambition or how vast their power, must be held accountable for their actions. History teaches us that leaders who fail to act in the best interests of their people, who prioritize their own desires over the needs of the many, are destined to bring ruin not just to themselves but to the empire they rule. Nero's failure to be accountable, both to his people and to history, is what sealed his tragic fate. As we conclude our exploration of Nero's reign, it's important to remember that history is not just a series of events. It is a collection of lessons. And Nero's story serves as one of the most glaring examples of the perils of power. The fall of his empire, though it occurred nearly 2,000 years ago, offers us timeless wisdom about the nature of leadership, responsibility, and the dangerous allure of unchecked authority. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more dark, twisted tales from history.